The smallest atom is hydrogen. It consists of a proton at the center and an electron moving around it in an orbital. Helium is the next biggest atom. It has 2 protons and 2 neutrons at the center, and if it's a neutral atom, it has 2 electrons moving in an orbital. And according to current atomic theory, as atoms get bigger and bigger, the electron orbitals become more complex. And these orbitals help us to explain why the atoms interact in the way that they do. But why is it that the orbitals become so complicated and orderly? It's almost like they were designed for a particular purpose. Well, if you combine these atoms, you make molecules, and some of the molecules that we use in our bodies are amino acids, carbohydrates, and lipids, and they form the building blocks of biological organisms. You've probably heard of the DNA double helix. Each strand of the double helix is made of subunits that we call nucleotides. Nucleotides are made of 3 parts: a phosphate group, a ring structure that we call a sugar, and another ring structure that we call a nitrogenous base. Each of these 3 parts is fairly complex, but when you put them together, you make one nucleotide. Do you know that there is not one chemist on the face of the planet who knows how one of these molecules could come about by natural processes outside the cell before the biological systems existed? And yet animals, plants, and people have quadrillions of these nucleotides, more than quadrillions. But not only do you have to create the nucleotides, you have to get them in the right proportions. There are 4 nucleotides that make up DNA, and they're named by the type of nitrogenous base that they contain. If you have adenine as a nitrogenous base, then we notate the nucleotide with the letter A. If you have guanine, we notate the nucleotide with the letter G. And if you have cytosine, C, and thymine, T. Again, the nucleotides are named after the nitrogenous base that they contain. Well, the way that DNA works is if you have an adenine nucleotide on one strand of the double helix, then you must have a thymine nucleotide directly across from it, and they connect. If you have a guanine nucleotide on one strand of the double helix, then you have to have the cytosine nucleotide across from it, and they connect. So what this means is that if you have 80 quadrillion adenine nucleotides, you must have exactly 80 quadrillion thymine nucleotides. And if you have 80 quadrillion guanine nucleotides, you must have exactly 80 quadrillion cytosine nucleotides. But not only do you have to create the nucleotides and get them in the right proportions, you also have to get them in the right sequence, because the sequence of these nucleotides determines whether or not you're going to be a giraffe, a salamander, a bird, or a mouse. But creating the nucleotides, getting them in the right proportions and in the right sequence, does you absolutely nothing. Because in order to use the DNA, you have to have a very complicated, sophisticated system. The way it works is the double helix opens up, and there's a machine that we call polymerase. That's where we get the letter P in PCR. PCR is a process that we use to detect things like viruses. The polymerase in PCR connects to one of the strands and copies the DNA into what we call a messenger RNA strand. And the messenger RNA strand goes out of the nucleus, and a machine called a ribosome attaches to it, and it reads it, and the ribosome produces what we call a polypeptide strand made of subunits called amino acids. And the problem that we have with amino acids is the same problem that we have with nucleotides. Amino acids are fairly complex, and there's 20 of them. How do we make these amino acids? How do we get them in the right proportions? Well, this polypeptide strand folds up into a machine that does work in your body. Before biological organisms existed, how would all this stuff happen by natural processes? And more importantly, why would it happen? Molecules don't have feelings. They don't have thoughts. If all of these things happened without intelligence, then there would have to be some sort of magical force that would make all this stuff occur. But in the world of science, this force does not exist. It has not been discovered. But the Holy Scriptures tell us that there is an intelligence. And for me personally, this is the greatest evidence that there is a God.